All right, let's dive in. You've seen it in the movies, right? A tense courtroom, lawyers are going at it, a witness is on the stand, and then, whoops, someone says something they absolutely shouldn't have. Biased, irrelevant, maybe totally wrong evidence is just hanging there in the air. For the jury, you can't just unhear something. So, what happens then? How does the justice system even begin to fix a mistake like that?
This is the core question for us today. When a trial veers off course and some piece of bad evidence slips through the cracks, what do you do? Can you really put that genie back in the bottle? Well, it turns out judges have a whole toolkit for trying to do just that.
Here's a great way to wrap your head around this. Think about building a really complex Lego set. You're deep into it and suddenly you spot it. A piece you put in like 10 steps back is completely wrong. So what's the plan? Do you just smash the whole thing to bits and start from scratch? Or can you carefully, really carefully, pull out that one wrong piece and fix everything around it? That's pretty much the exact spot a judge finds themselves in. Okay, so first things first. Let's look at how these mistakes actually happen. It's not always as dramatic as a lawyer shouting, "Objection!" a split second too late. The reality is often a little more ordinary. These errors can sneak in from all over the place. A judge can just have a moment of reflection and realize an earlier ruling they made was a mistake. Or maybe a lawyer promises, "Your Honor, I'll connect this piece of evidence to the case later," but then they just don't. Sometimes it's as simple as a witness blurting something out by accident, or a rambling witness getting loose during cross-examination. And here's a tricky one. Sometimes evidence seems perfectly fine when it's introduced, but later it becomes clear that it's just way more harmful than it is helpful. It happens.
So, when one of those mistakes happens, the judge has a sort of escalation ladder of options. And we're going to start at the bottom rung with the simplest fixes for the smallest problems. The first simplest fix is actually kind of subtle. The judge can decide to do, well, almost nothing. If it's a really small mistake, they might just strike it from the official record, on paper, without saying a word to the jury. Now, why would they do that? Well, because sometimes pointing it out just makes it a bigger deal. It's like telling someone don't think of a pink elephant. But if the slip-up is a bit more serious, the judge has to step in. That's option 2. They'll directly tell the jury, "Hey, that thing you just heard, it's been withdrawn. You have to disregard it." It's a clear, direct command to get things back on track.
But what happens when a simple instruction just doesn't cut it? What if the damage feels bigger? And just telling the jury to ignore it feels a bit weak. That's when we climb up the ladder to a much stronger warning. This quote from a Chief Justice, man, it really hits the nail on the head. He said that sometimes you need something more than just a formal and frigid instruction. I love that phrase, frigid withdrawal. It captures it perfectly. When the basic fairness of the trial is at stake, you gotta do more. So what does this something more actually look like? It's all about tone and emphasis. The judge needs to deliver a much stronger, more serious direction. They might say something like, "Listen to me very carefully. You must consider this case as if that evidence was never, ever spoken in this courtroom." The idea is to really try and help the jury perform that tough mental trick of completely erasing what they heard. Okay, and that brings us to the very top of the ladder, the final, most extreme option. This is the last resort, when a judge decides that no warning, no matter how strongly worded, is going to be enough to repair the damage. We're talking about evidence that is so toxic, so deeply prejudicial, that it has permanently poisoned the well. The Lego model can't be fixed. The entire structure is compromised. At this point, the judge is staring at the most drastic step a court can take. And that leads us to the nuclear option, right? Discharging the entire jury. You are that right. The whole thing gets called off. A new trial has to be ordered, and everybody literally starts from square one. It is a massive, expensive, and, as one source called it, unpalatable decision. It's a step that's only taken when the judge looks at the situation and thinks, there is just no way to have a fair trial from here. But judges do not take this step lightly. They will absolutely avoid it if they can. So for example, if it's a super long trial, a single mistake might just get, and I'm quoting here, drowned in the volume of testimony. Or if the case against the accused is already incredibly strong, one bad piece of evidence might not really move the needle.
Another reason is if the improper evidence just gives a little preview of something that was going to come out legally anyway. In that case, the judge might figure the real damage is pretty small.
So, everything we've talked about so far has been about fixing mistakes after they've already happened. But there is another way, a kind of preventative measure that works in specific situations.
It has one of those great old Latin names, de bene esse. It basically means for what it's worth. What happens is a judge will provisionally let some evidence in without making a final call on whether it's actually admissible. They're essentially saying, look, let's just hear it for now and we'll argue about whether it officially counts later on, but only if it ends up being important. It can be a huge time saver.
But, and this is a big but, this practice really only works in what's called a judge-only trial, no jury. Why is that? Because a professional, trained judge is expected to have the discipline to mentally put that evidence aside if they later rule it's inadmissible. You just can't ask a jury of regular citizens to do that. It's seen as totally unworkable. You'd be exposing them to potentially toxic evidence they can't unhear. You know what they say, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
And this really brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? All of these tools we've talked about, from the quiet little fix to the absolute nuclear option of turfing the whole jury, they're all based on one huge assumption. Can we, as people, really ignore something once we've heard it? The law basically has to work on the idea that, yes, we can. But, as one legal scholar put it so perfectly, the court cannot pretend the evidence has not been given. And that tension, right there, that's at the absolute heart of the struggle for justice. Thanks so much for tuning in.